Tonight, we're stepping into the extraordinary life of Albert Einstein, not just the genius who gave us E=mc², but the curious soul who questioned everything from a young age, challenged the rules of time and space, and forever changed the way we see the universe. Before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, especially if you're here for a calm, thoughtful story to help you drift off. Now, turn down the lights, wrap yourself in a warm blanket, and settle in as we begin the timeless journey through the life of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein was born on March 14th, 1879, in the southern German city of Ulm, in the Kingdom of Württemberg, part of the German Empire. His arrival into the world was, by all accounts, quiet and unassuming. But what lay ahead would be anything but ordinary. He was the first child of Hermann Einstein, a salesman and engineer, and Pauline Koch, a cultured woman with a deep appreciation for music. The Einsteins were secular Jews, middle class, and intellectually curious. They lived modestly, moving shortly after Albert's birth to Munich, where Hermann and his brother Jakob founded an electrical engineering company. From an early age, Albert was different. According to family law, he was a late talker, not speaking fluently until around the age of 3. Some even worried he might never speak at all. When he did begin forming full sentences, he often repeated them softly to himself, a trait he would carry into adulthood. But behind the quiet exterior was a mind that never stopped turning. Even as a toddler, Albert was prone to intense observation. He would stare at objects for long periods, fascinated by how they worked and moved. There was a depth to his curiosity that was hard to miss. One of the earliest experiences that left a deep impression on young Albert came at the age of 5. While recovering from an illness, his father brought him a compass, a small, ordinary object. But as Albert watched the needle swing and settle, seemingly without any physical force acting upon it, he was struck with awe. How could something invisible cause such movement? The moment lit a spark. He would later recall that this encounter was one of the formative events that sparked his lifelong fascination with the unseen forces of nature. Growing up in Munich, Einstein attended a Catholic elementary school, despite his Jewish heritage, and later moved on to the Luitpold Gymnasium, a prestigious secondary school. It was there that he began to feel stifled by the rigid structure of German education. The system emphasized rote memorization and strict discipline, but Albert's mind craved exploration. He disliked the authoritarian tone of many of his teachers, and was often bored with the material. Still, he excelled in math and science, subjects that allowed for abstraction, logic, and deep inquiry. At home, Einstein was nurtured by his mother's love of music. She was a pianist and encouraged Albert to play the violin, which he began learning at age 6. Though he initially disliked practicing, he grew to love music, especially Mozart, and later, Beethoven. Music became a refuge, something he would return to throughout his life, not just as a hobby, but as a way to think and feel more deeply. "I often think in music," he once said. "I live my daydreams in music." His uncle Jakob and a family friend, Max Talmud, later Max Talmy, played critical roles in shaping young Einstein's thinking. Max Talmy, a medical student who dined with the Einsteins weekly, began giving Albert popular science books when he was just 10 years old. These included books on geometry, natural science, and philosophical ideas. One of them, a series called Popular Books on Natural Science by Aaron Bernstein, introduced Einstein to concepts like the speed of light and space travel, long before they became central to his own work. Albert devoured them, often studying advanced mathematics on his own far ahead of the school curriculum. By the time he was 12, Einstein had taught himself Euclidean geometry and begun to explore calculus. He became so passionate about the subject that he described the experience of encountering geometry as a kind of spiritual awakening. Numbers and shapes, formulas and theorems. These were not just exercises on a page to him. They were a glimpse into the underlying harmony of the universe. Despite his academic talents, his school life remained tense. Teachers found him uncooperative, sometimes rebellious. His refusal to conform didn't go unnoticed. One teacher reportedly told him he would never amount to anything. And when his father's business failed and the family moved to Milan, Italy, Albert remained behind to finish his schooling. But he was miserable and soon left without a diploma, joining his family in Italy instead. For a while, his future seemed uncertain. At 16, Einstein renounced his German citizenship to avoid compulsory military service. He was now stateless, a young man without a country, without a diploma, and without clear direction. But his resolve never wavered. He applied to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich, known for its progressive stance on education and its focus on science and engineering. He failed the entrance exam on his first try, excelling in math and physics, but falling short in other subjects like language and biology. However, he was allowed to enroll in a Swiss preparatory school in Aarau to complete his secondary education. Aarau was a different world for Einstein. The atmosphere was liberal, the teachers encouraged critical thinking, and the students were treated with respect. It was here that Einstein flourished. He lived with the Winterler family, forming close bonds and even falling in love with their daughter, Marie. The experience helped shape his views on education, equality, and individuality. It was during this time, in a quiet moment of thought, that he began imagining what it would be like to ride alongside a beam of light, a thought experiment that would later form the foundation of his theory of special relativity. In 1896, Einstein was accepted into the Polytechnic in Zurich, entering the physics teaching diploma program. It was here that he met lifelong friends and important figures in his personal and professional life, including Marcel Grossmann, a mathematician who would later help him with the complex math of general relativity. Einstein's relationship with professors, however, remained strained. He often skipped lectures, preferring to study independently or spend time with friends debating scientific and philosophical ideas late into the night. During his years at the Polytechnic, Einstein began corresponding with a fellow student, Mileva Maric, a Serbian woman, and one of the few female students in the program. Their relationship was intense, intellectual, and romantic. The two shared a passion for physics and a mutual sense of being outsiders. Their letters revealed a deep bond formed over their shared love for science and a growing emotional connection. In the years to come, this relationship would evolve into marriage, parenthood, and later, hardship. After graduating in 1900, Einstein hoped to secure a position at a university, but his rebellious nature and rocky relationships with professors made it difficult. For 2 years, he drifted, taking temporary teaching positions, tutoring, and writing scientific papers in his spare time. Eventually, through a friend's connection, he landed a job at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. It wasn't glamorous, but it offered stability. More importantly, it gave him the mental space to think. While working at the patent office, Einstein reviewed technical documents by day and conducted thought experiments by night. It was in this quiet routine that one of the greatest scientific revolutions of all time would begin to take shape. But outside of work, life was becoming more complicated. He and Mileva had a daughter, Liesel, born in secret, and whose fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of Einstein's life. It's believed she either died in infancy or was given up for adoption. Not long after, in 1903, Albert and Mileva married. Their marriage was marked by both collaboration and strain. They would go on to have 2 sons, Hans Albert and Eduard, and for a time they found comfort in one another's company. But tension grew in the background, as Einstein's ambitions pulled him further into his work and away from domestic life. Still, during these years, he developed the ideas that would define his legacy: the relativity of time and space, the behavior of light, the relationship between mass and energy. The stage was quietly being set for 1905, the year now known as his Annus Mirabilis, or Miracle Year, when a 26-year-old patent clerk would publish a series of papers that would shake the foundations of modern physics. But before we arrive at that turning point, we must first understand the inner life of a man divided between family and career, between public expectations and private truths, between the restless mind and the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. In the quiet halls of the Swiss Patent Office, Albert Einstein was leading a double life. By day, he sifted through applications for inventions, meticulously analyzing technical claims. But by night, and often during stolen moments in between, he was thinking deeply, almost obsessively, about the structure of reality itself. He wasn't employed as a scientist. He had no lab, no grant, no prestigious university position. Yet it was in this quiet, unassuming environment that Einstein made history. The year was 1905. Einstein was 26 years old, a newlywed, a father, and still unknown to the broader scientific community. But something extraordinary happened that year. In a span of just a few months, Einstein published 4 groundbreaking papers in the Annalen der Physik, one of the leading physics journals of the time. These papers would not only reshape the field of physics, they would permanently alter our understanding of the universe. The first paper explored the photoelectric effect, the phenomenon where light can eject electrons from a material. At the time, classical physics couldn't fully explain this. Einstein proposed something radical, that light behaved not just as a wave, but as discrete packets of energy, or quanta. This idea laid the groundwork for quantum theory, and would eventually earn him the Nobel Prize, not for relativity, but for this early and daring insight. His second paper tackled Brownian motion, the seemingly random movement of particles suspended in a fluid. Through careful statistical analysis, Einstein showed that this jittery behavior could be explained by the collisions of molecules, providing powerful evidence for the existence of atoms and molecules, which were still debated at the time. It was one of the earliest and most persuasive proofs of the atomic theory of matter. Then came the third, perhaps his most famous, the special theory of relativity. In it, Einstein proposed that space and time were not absolute but relative, depending on the motion of the observer. He dismantled centuries of Newtonian thinking with the bold statement that the laws of physics are the same for all non-accelerating observers, and that the speed of light is constant, no matter the observer's speed. This wasn't just a technical tweak. It was a seismic shift in how we understand motion, light, and time itself. Finally, his fourth paper, just a few pages long, contained the now legendary equation, E equals mc squared. With it, Einstein unveiled a deep and terrifying truth. Mass and energy are interchangeable. This deceptively simple formula hinted at vast stores of energy locked within matter, a concept that would later help usher in the nuclear age, though that outcome was still decades away. Despite the brilliance of these papers, they didn't catapult Einstein to instant stardom. Recognition came slowly. A few leading physicists took notice, and gradually, his name began to circulate in academic circles. Over the next few years, Einstein continued to publish, expanding on his work and delving deeper into the nature of space and time. In 1909, he finally left the patent office and accepted a position as a lecturer at the University of Zurich. As his academic career began to take shape, so too did his public reputation. Universities in Prague and then back in Zurich sought him out. He gained a reputation not only for his theoretical brilliance, but also for his relaxed, informal demeanor. He was not the aloof professor. He was approachable, often disheveled, and deeply passionate about ideas. Students were drawn to him, as were colleagues, intrigued by the young physicist who seemed to think in entirely new dimensions. In 1913, Einstein was invited to join the Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin, a major honor. He accepted the position and moved to the city that would become his intellectual home for the next 2 decades. There, he was given the freedom to pursue research without teaching obligations, surrounded by the finest minds in German science. But as his scientific star was rising, his personal life was becoming increasingly strained. His marriage to Mileva was deteriorating. Their once deep intellectual connection had faded. Mileva struggled to find her place in Berlin, and tensions mounted over parenting, finances, and Einstein's growing emotional distance. He had begun to pursue other women, including a renewed connection with his cousin, Elsa Lowenthal, with whom he would later begin a controversial relationship. By 1914, Albert and Mileva were separated. Mileva returned to Zurich with their sons, and in the years that followed, Einstein's bond with his family would fracture further, particularly with his youngest son, Eduard, whose struggles with mental illness would haunt the family's legacy. But these personal hardships did not slow Einstein's scientific momentum. In fact, during this same period, he was hard at work on one of the most ambitious projects in the history of physics, the general theory of relativity. Building on his special theory, he sought to describe gravity not as a force between masses, as Newton had, but as the warping of space and time itself by massive objects. It was a complex, math-heavy endeavor that would take him years to develop, with help from mathematicians like Marcel Grossmann. Einstein toiled over equations, often frustrated, sometimes convinced he was on the wrong path. But by 1915, he had succeeded. He presented his final field equations to the Prussian Academy, stunning the scientific world. General relativity predicted phenomena no other theory could, including the bending of light around massive objects like stars. The challenge now was to test it. That opportunity came in 1919, when a total solar eclipse offered the perfect conditions to observe the predicted deflection of starlight by the sun's gravity. British astronomer Arthur Eddington led the expedition, and the results were decisive. The starlight did bend, just as Einstein's theory had predicted. The announcement made headlines worldwide. Overnight, Albert Einstein became a global celebrity, a symbol of human genius and the mysterious power of the universe. Photographs of the wild-haired physicist appeared on the front pages of newspapers across continents. He was hailed not just as a scientist, but as a philosopher, a prophet of the new age. Invitations flooded in from universities, societies, and heads of state. He traveled to London, Paris, New York, cheered by crowds, celebrated by intellectuals, and welcomed by leaders. But while the world marveled at the man who had bent space and time, Einstein remained wary of fame. He once said, "With fame, I become more and more stupid," which of course is a very common phenomenon. Even as the limelight grew brighter, Einstein's focus remained fixed on larger concerns. He began using his voice to speak on matters far beyond physics, on war, nationalism, and human rights. He had lived through the horrors of World War I and saw firsthand the dangers of unchecked militarism. He became an outspoken pacifist, Zionist, and internationalist, advocating for a world where knowledge, cooperation, and peace could triumph over division and destruction. Back in Berlin, he officially divorced Mileva in 1919, agreeing to send her any future Nobel Prize money as part of the settlement, a promise he would fulfill just 2 years later. That same year, he married Elsa, his cousin, who had become his emotional anchor during years of personal upheaval. They settled into a new life together, sharing a home in Berlin and later a summer house in Kaputh, near Potsdam. Yet even in moments of peace, Einstein's mind never slowed. He continued to work feverishly, chasing the elusive goal of a unified field theory, a single framework that could combine the forces of gravity and electromagnetism. It was a quest that would occupy much of the rest of his life, and though he never solved it, he poured himself into the effort. At the same time, the political landscape in Germany was shifting ominously. Economic turmoil, rising anti-Semitism, and the seeds of fascism were beginning to take root. Shadows that would soon stretch across all of Europe and force Einstein to make one of the most difficult choices of his life. By 1915, Albert Einstein had become a name quietly passed between the lips of academics across Europe. His work on the general theory of relativity was nearing completion, but behind the chalkboards and lecture halls, his personal life continued to stir with complication and transformation. Still residing in Berlin after accepting a position at the Prussian Academy of Sciences, Einstein had fully separated from his wife Mileva Maric. The emotional strain had been building for years, not just from Einstein's relentless devotion to his work, but from the slow erosion of trust and intimacy between them. Although they remained married on paper until 1919, their relationship was a shell of its former self. Einstein was now living apart from Mileva and their 2 sons, Hans Albert and Eduard, who remained in Zurich with their mother. He wrote to them often, particularly to Hans Albert, nurturing his son's budding interest in engineering and the natural world. While Einstein's family life grew more distant, his professional life surged forward with intensity. In November of 1915, after a series of sleepless nights and rigorous mathematical reworking, Einstein presented the finalized field equations for general relativity to the Prussian Academy. The theory was breathtaking in its implications. It replaced Newton's long-held laws of gravitation with a new understanding that mass could curve the very fabric of space and time. Despite the elegance of the theory, Einstein was met with initial skepticism. The mathematics were dense, the concepts abstract. But validation came soon. In 1919, during a solar eclipse, British astronomer Arthur Eddington led an expedition to test one of general relativity's predictions, that starlight passing near the sun would be bent by its gravitational field. The results matched Einstein's equations. Almost overnight, Einstein was thrust from quiet scientific celebrity into global fame. Newspapers around the world printed his name in bold. Headlines like "Revolution in Science" and "Lights All Askew in the Heavens" announced his triumph. For the first time, the image of the genius physicist became a cultural phenomenon. Einstein, with his unkempt hair, absent-minded air, and charming disregard for formality, captivated the public. But fame was something he wore with discomfort. He preferred deep thought to interviews, blackboards to flashing cameras. Still, he played the role as best he could, speaking before large audiences and writing essays for broader readerships, all while continuing his scientific research. His relationship with Elsa Lowenthal, a cousin and longtime companion, had deepened over these years. Elsa provided the domestic stability and emotional support Einstein craved, often handling his schedule, protecting him from the intrusions of the press, and tending to his health, which occasionally faltered under the stress of his work and travel. They married in 1919, shortly after his divorce from Mileva was finalized. It was not a passionate relationship in the traditional sense, but one rooted in mutual understanding and convenience. Elsa's daughters from a previous marriage, Ilse and Margot, lived with them and became part of Einstein's somewhat unconventional household. Einstein's fame gave him a platform, and he did not shy away from using it. He became increasingly vocal about issues beyond physics, especially pacifism, civil liberties, and Zionism. A lifelong opponent of war, Einstein condemned the violence of World War I and advocated for international cooperation and disarmament. His Jewish heritage, though not always central to his personal identity, took on new significance as anti-Semitic sentiments began to rise across Europe. He aligned himself with the Zionist movement, supporting the idea of a Jewish cultural and academic homeland in Palestine, though he remained wary of nationalism in all its forms. Back in the realm of science, Einstein's post-relativity years were far from idle. He turned his attention to unifying the fundamental forces of nature, a quest that would occupy him for the rest of his life. The idea of a unified field theory consumed his thoughts, as he sought to reconcile the new gravitational framework of relativity with the mysterious behavior of electromagnetism. The math was elusive, the path uncertain, but Einstein pressed on with stubborn devotion. As the 1920s progressed, Einstein's fame brought him across the globe. In 1921, he embarked on a lecture tour of the United States, where he was welcomed with enormous fanfare. Crowds gathered outside his hotels, reporters scrambled for interviews, and universities offered honorary degrees. He met President Harding and addressed Congress. Yet behind the spectacle, Einstein's thoughts remained focused on the universal laws that govern the cosmos and the moral laws that, he believed, should govern humanity. Amid all of this, his relationship with his sons remained strained. Hans Albert, now a young adult, pursued civil engineering, while Eduard, the younger son, showed great promise in poetry and philosophy, but also began to exhibit signs of mental illness. Einstein, often distant and unsure of how to handle emotional complexity, struggled to connect. Eduard would eventually be diagnosed with schizophrenia, spending much of his adult life in Swiss institutions. The weight of this tragedy haunted Einstein for the rest of his days, a source of quiet sorrow rarely mentioned, but deeply felt. Back in Europe, Einstein's world was changing. The political tides of Germany were shifting, economic turmoil and cultural upheaval were mounting, and darker clouds were beginning to gather. In the decade following his meteoric rise to global prominence, Einstein would face increasing hostility from nationalist and anti-Semitic groups within Germany. Some even labelled his work Jewish physics, denouncing it as heretical and unpatriotic. Still, Einstein held fast to his values and his vision. In 1925, he visited South America and later travelled to Asia, including a much publicized journey to Japan. He marveled at the cultural depth and humility of the people he met, noting his observations in letters and journals with the eye of a philosopher as much as a physicist. He returned to Europe with a deeper appreciation for the interconnectedness of all human cultures. But trouble was stirring back home. In the years ahead, the very country that had elevated him would turn hostile, forcing him to make one of the most pivotal decisions of his life, whether to stay in Germany or leave everything behind. As the 1930s dawned and the Nazi Party gained ground, Einstein's position in Germany grew more precarious. He was a target not only for his scientific views, but for his outspokenness on Jewish identity, civil rights, and anti-nationalism. His home was raided, his books burned, and his lectures protested, all while he continued to work, to write, and to advocate for peace. But change was coming, and soon Albert Einstein, now one of the most famous minds on Earth, would be forced to abandon the country of his greatest triumphs and begin anew on foreign shores. As the 1930s dawned, the world teetered on the edge of turmoil once again, and Albert Einstein, now a household name, found himself walking a tightrope between science and survival. He had become not just a symbol of intellectual revolution, but a political lightning rod in an increasingly unstable Germany. By this time, Einstein was well into his 50s. His name had reached a mythic status, often misunderstood, but universally admired. Yet, behind the international praise, tensions brewed. The Weimar Republic, already fragile, was collapsing under the pressure of economic despair, political division, and growing anti-Semitic sentiment. Right-wing factions gained momentum, and Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party rose swiftly and ominously. Einstein, a proud pacifist and outspoken Jew, was an obvious target. He had long spoken out against war and violence, having once declared that nationalism is an infantile disease, the measles of mankind. But as the Nazi propaganda machine began to identify enemies of the state, Einstein's ideals and his heritage placed him in the crosshairs. By 1932, it was no longer safe for him in Germany. His home was raided by the Nazis, his books publicly burned, and his name appeared on lists of enemies of the Reich. One German magazine even published a mock wanted poster offering a reward for his assassination. It was chilling and deeply personal. With great reluctance but unwavering clarity, Einstein chose exile. He accepted a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. It wasn't just a career move, it was a lifeline. In 1933, just as Hitler seized power and Jews were systematically expelled from public life, Einstein renounced his German citizenship for the second time in his life, vowing never to return. That same year, he and his wife Elsa sailed for America, seeking refuge in a nation that viewed him as both genius and curiosity. Einstein's arrival in the US was met with fanfare. Reporters crowded the docks in New York, eager to photograph the wild-haired scientist who had fled tyranny. But Einstein had little interest in spectacle. What concerned him now was the creeping tide of fascism and the danger it posed to the world. Though his English was imperfect, Einstein made powerful public statements. He spoke at universities, penned essays, and met with journalists, warning of the dangers of authoritarianism. He called for civil liberties, racial equality, and the protection of democracy, values he saw as increasingly under threat. Despite the heavy political climate, Einstein continued his scientific work at Princeton. But something had shifted. Though his office was nestled in the serene woods of New Jersey, his thoughts were often darkened by the state of the world. The unified field theory remained elusive, and though he worked tirelessly on it, success never came. Some scholars began to view him as out of step with the new quantum era, which was advancing without his full embrace. Still, he remained active in scientific discourse. He wrote to colleagues, advised doctoral students, and maintained correspondence with major physicists around the globe. His disagreements with the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics, particularly with Niels Bohr, grew more intense. Einstein famously quipped, "God does not play dice with the universe," expressing his discomfort with the idea that fundamental processes could be governed by chance. Meanwhile, his home life in America was one of modest routine. Einstein lived in a simple house on Mercer Street in Princeton with Elsa, who served as his gatekeeper and confidant. He was known to walk the streets in worn sweaters and no socks, often stopping to chat with children or play his violin. Despite his fame, he craved normalcy and simplicity. But tragedy struck in 1936 when Elsa died after a long illness. Einstein, devastated, withdrew further into his work. Though never one to show much sentimentality, those close to him noticed a deep sadness that lingered well beyond her passing. He remained close to his stepdaughters, particularly Margot, but the loneliness was undeniable. As the decade wore on and World War II loomed, Einstein's focus began to shift again, from theoretical musings to global survival. In 1938, Einstein received troubling news. German physicists had succeeded in splitting the uranium atom. Nuclear fission had been discovered. The implications were enormous. If harnessed, this reaction could lead to the most powerful weapon humanity had ever known. And worse, the Nazi regime might be the first to build it. Einstein, a lifelong pacifist, found himself in an ethical crisis. Though he was no longer active in nuclear physics, his name carried enormous weight. At the urging of Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, Einstein signed a now famous letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1939. The letter warned of Nazi Germany's potential development of atomic weapons and urged the United States to begin its own research. This letter, just a few pages long, would spark the creation of the Manhattan Project. Einstein had no direct role in the project itself. He was not given security clearance and remained somewhat on the periphery. But the moral weight of that letter haunted him. Though he believed the weapon was necessary to counter a fascist threat, he feared what mankind might do with such power. The world was entering a new era, one he had helped to usher in, albeit indirectly. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, Einstein's life would grow more complex still, tangled in geopolitics, ethical debates, and the beginnings of a Cold War. He remained an icon of peace in a time of unprecedented violence, and the years ahead would test his beliefs, relationships, and resilience more than ever before. As the 1940s began, the world was engulfed in the most devastating conflict in human history. World War II raged across Europe, Africa, and Asia, and Albert Einstein, though far from the front lines, found himself caught in a moral and scientific storm of unimaginable scale. The letter he had signed to President Roosevelt in 1939, warning of the potential for a Nazi atomic bomb, had done more than sound the alarm. It had laid the groundwork for the United States to launch the top-secret Manhattan Project. Yet, despite his status as one of the most famous physicists alive, Einstein was never asked to join the project. US officials, wary of his known pacifism and left-leaning politics, kept him at arm's length. His access to classified information was restricted. Still, the irony remained. It was Einstein's warning that had accelerated America's race to build the bomb, and his theory of relativity, particularly the equation E equals mc squared, that explained how mass could be converted into an enormous amount of energy. Though he didn't split the atom himself, his intellectual fingerprints were on the very foundation of nuclear power. Throughout the war, Einstein worked quietly at Princeton. He continued to develop his unified field theory, trying to reconcile gravity with electromagnetism, a pursuit that increasingly isolated him from the rest of the physics community. The new generation of physicists had moved on, diving deep into quantum mechanics, a realm Einstein remained uneasy with. Yet even as he aged, he remained curious, opinionated, and deeply involved in world affairs. When the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Einstein was devastated. He later called the event a tragedy of science turned to destruction. Though he understood why the weapon had been used to end the war, the reality of what it unleashed, the deaths of over 200,000 people, and the beginning of a nuclear age, struck him profoundly. He became an outspoken advocate for nuclear disarmament almost immediately after the war. He joined forces with scientists and intellectuals, warning that humanity now possessed the tools to destroy itself. In a letter to a Japanese pacifist, Einstein wrote, "I made one great mistake in my life when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt." This marked a new chapter in his public life. Einstein now used his fame not just for scientific discourse, but for activism. He co-founded the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, working with peers like Leo Szilard and Harold Urey to educate the public about the dangers of nuclear proliferation. They were not just concerned about the weapons themselves, but the secrecy, the arms race, and the potential for a devastating global miscalculation. Einstein's pacifism, once controversial, gained renewed urgency in the post-war world. Meanwhile, in the United States, the political climate was shifting. The Cold War had begun, and paranoia gripped Washington. Anti-communist hysteria swept the country, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee. Intellectuals, immigrants, and anyone with ties to left-wing politics were scrutinized. Einstein, who had associated with progressive causes, found himself once again under suspicion. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover kept an extensive file on him, over 1,400 pages. Though there was never any concrete evidence of espionage or subversion, Einstein's loyalty was constantly questioned. He refused to remain silent. He criticized the rise of McCarthyism, calling it a betrayal of American values. He defended accused academics and advised fellow intellectuals not to cooperate with congressional investigations. In his view, the freedom to think, speak, and dissent was non-negotiable. His politics extended beyond nuclear weapons and civil liberties. Einstein also spoke out against racism in the United States, something that deeply disturbed him. He openly supported the civil rights movement and was a friend and admirer of W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, both of whom were targets of anti-communist campaigns. In 1946, Einstein gave a speech at Lincoln University, a historically black college in Pennsylvania, where he declared, "Racism is America's worst disease." He believed that as a Jew who had fled Nazi Germany, it was his moral duty to speak against the systemic injustice he saw in his adopted homeland. Though his activism was admired by many, it also drew criticism. Some Americans wanted Einstein to stick to physics, not politics. But to Einstein, the two were inseparable. Science was not just about discovery, it was about responsibility. During this same period, Einstein's personal life settled into a kind of quiet rhythm. He lived alone in his Princeton home, surrounded by books, papers, and visitors from around the world. He never remarried after Elsa's death. He spent time with his stepdaughters, maintained correspondence with scientists and politicians alike, and took long walks, often lost in thought. One of the more fascinating relationships he developed in his later years was with a young African-American opera singer named Marian Anderson. Einstein invited her to stay in his home after she was denied lodging at a local hotel because of her race. They became close friends, and Anderson recalled his warmth and sense of justice. Despite declining health, Einstein remained intellectually active. He continued to publish papers, give lectures, and speak with students and colleagues. Though he never succeeded in formulating a final theory of everything, he never stopped searching. He believed deeply that nature was harmonious, that beneath the chaos of the universe, there was an elegant order waiting to be revealed. By the early 1950s, the world had changed again. The Soviet Union had developed its own atomic bomb. The Korean War had begun. The US was now developing the even more powerful hydrogen bomb, a weapon Einstein fiercely opposed. He warned that a new arms race would only lead to mutual destruction. He used whatever platform he had left to push for peace. He collaborated with Bertrand Russell to draft what would become the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, a statement urging the world's leaders to renounce war and seek diplomatic solutions before it was too late. The manifesto would become one of Einstein's final public acts. But even as Einstein's political and ethical concerns filled his final years, his personal legacy was undergoing quiet transformation. Letters from admirers flooded in from around the world. Schoolchildren sent drawings and questions. Scientists visited him in hopes of catching a glimpse of his thought process. He was no longer just a physicist. He was a global sage, a symbol of both intellect and conscience. And yet, even with all this acclaim, he remained surprisingly private. He hated the cult of celebrity, dismissing it as nonsense. He refused awards and honors, rarely attended banquets, and often asked not to be photographed. He valued ideas over image, curiosity over ceremony. To those who asked about his legacy, he often replied with a shrug. What is right is not always popular, and what is popular is not always right. But time was running out. Einstein's health was deteriorating. He had long suffered from abdominal issues, and by 1955, his aorta had begun to rupture. Doctors recommended surgery, but Einstein refused. "I want to go when I want," he said. "It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share." What happened in his final days, and what would follow after his death, would raise questions about privacy, ethics, and legacy that would persist for decades to come. On the morning of April 17th, 1955, Albert Einstein awoke in his Princeton home, feeling weaker than usual. The persistent pain in his abdomen, caused by an abdominal aortic aneurysm that had long been troubling him, had grown sharper. As the hours passed, he was rushed to the Princeton hospital, where doctors quickly recognized the severity of his condition. His aorta was rupturing. Even then, Einstein's mind remained focused and alert. As he lay in the hospital bed, slipping in and out of lucidity, he reportedly continued working on a speech he had been preparing for a television appearance commemorating Israel's 7th Independence Day. The notes, scribbled in German, were never completed. He never delivered the speech. That night, Albert Einstein died quietly at the age of 76. What followed in the hours after his death would become one of the most bizarre and controversial episodes in scientific history. Without permission from Einstein's family, Dr. Thomas Stoltz Harvey, the pathologist on duty, removed Einstein's brain during the autopsy. Harvey had hoped to study the brain in search of physical clues that could explain the roots of genius. He preserved it in formaldehyde, photographed it, and later cut it into over 200 pieces, distributing some samples to researchers and storing others in jars, which he kept in a cider box in his office and, for a time, in his home refrigerator. Einstein had made it clear that he did not want his body or brain to become idolized. He had requested to be cremated, his ashes scattered in an undisclosed location to avoid a grave becoming a shrine. And yet, the removal of his brain without consent sparked decades of ethical debate, blurring the line between scientific curiosity and personal privacy. Despite the controversy, some researchers did study the samples of Einstein's brain. Over the years, studies claimed to find unusual features in his parietal lobe, areas associated with spatial reasoning and mathematics. Others suggested that the corpus callosum, the connective tissue between the brain's hemispheres, was thicker than average, possibly indicating more efficient interhemispheric communication. But these claims were often debated and criticized. The sample size was too small, the comparisons were limited, and the broader question loomed: could a person's brilliance really be reduced to anatomy?